Every system of power has moments when it speaks more honestly than it intends to, not in prepared statements, not in official speeches, but in quiet disclosures, offered almost casually by the people closest to the center. This week, one such moment emerged from an extended interview published by Vanity Fair featuring senior figures inside the current White House, including the president's chief of staff. At first glance, this might appear to be just another political article, quickly absorbed and just as quickly forgotten. But this one is different, not because of who was criticized, but because of who was doing the talking. Chiefs of staff are not hired to tell stories. They are hired to prevent them. Their role is to manage chaos, impose discipline, and protect institutions from the excesses of power. So when a chief of staff publicly acknowledges repeated internal failures, failures to restrain, to correct, to redirect, it raises a question far more serious than scandal. It raises a question about governance itself, because when the systems designed to contain power stop functioning quietly, dysfunction doesn't disappear. It becomes policy. And in moments like this, the issue is no longer about personalities or politics. It is about whether democratic systems can still do what they were built to do, restrain power before it restrains the public. To understand why this moment matters, we have to be precise about what actually happened, and just as important, what did not. This was not a leaked memo. It was not an anonymous tip. It was not an off-the-record conversation quietly slipped to a reporter. This was a deliberate, long-form interview process conducted over many months, involving multiple members of the president's inner circle, culminating in a coordinated photo shoot and a national publication. In other words, this was not an accident. The interview centered on Susie Wiles, the president's chief of staff, a position that sits at the nerve center of executive power. Every decision that reaches the president and every decision that leaves his desk passes through that office. When someone in that role speaks publicly, they are not offering gossip. They are offering insight into how power is actually being exercised. What makes this moment distinct is not that internal disagreement exists. Disagreement exists in every administration. What makes it distinct is the acknowledgement that efforts to restrain presidential behavior repeatedly failed, and that those failures were understood internally as part of the system, not exceptions to it. The interview describes attempts to discourage retaliatory actions against political opponents, to prevent inflammatory claims unsupported by evidence, and to moderate decisions with serious legal and social consequences. In several cases, those efforts did not succeed. That distinction matters because it tells us this is not a story about one controversial comment or one misjudged decision. It is a story about patterns, patterns of impulse, loyalty, and resistance to constraint. And when patterns emerge at the highest level of government, they do not remain internal for long. They shape policy, they shape institutions, and eventually they shape everyday life. To grasp the significance of these disclosures, we need to step back and understand what the role of a chief of staff is supposed to be, not in theory, but in practice. In modern American governance, the chief of staff serves as a stabilizing force. They control access, filter information, enforce discipline, and when necessary say no, even to the president. Historically strong chiefs of staff have acted as institutional shock absorbers. They translate political instinct into policy reality. They slow decisions when consequences are unclear. And they protect the presidency from becoming an extension of personal impulse. This role exists precisely because no individual, regardless of experience or intention, should operate without constraint. What emerges from this interview is a picture of that role under strain. According to the account, warnings were issued internally, objections were raised, concerns were documented, yet again and again decisions moved forward anyway. That tells us something important. The problem was not a lack of advice. It was a lack of authority to enforce it. This distinction matters because democracies rely not just on elections, but on norms, shared understandings about restraint, evidence, and limits. When those norms weaken, formal rules are forced to carry more weight than they were designed to bear, and formal rules by themselves are slow. They cannot respond in real time to impulse, retaliation, or misinformation. The interview also reveals an internal culture where loyalty appears to have outweighed correction, and where managing fallout became more common than preventing mistakes. That is not a personnel issue, it is a structural one. When senior advisors describe their role as containment rather than governance, it suggests that the system is reacting rather than leading. And once a government becomes reactive at its core, decisions are shaped less by long-term consequence and more by immediate pressure. When we strip away the commentary and focus only on what is being described, a clearer pattern begins to emerge. This is not a story about isolated missteps. It is a story about how power behaves when restraint becomes optional. The interview outlines repeated efforts by senior staff to discourage actions driven by personal grievance rather than public interest. Legal pressure against political opponents was discussed internally, not as a matter of evidence, but as a form of retaliation. Claims made publicly were known within the administration to lack verification. Warnings were raised about pardons, deportations, and inflammatory rhetoric, and then overridden. What matters here is not that advisors disagreed. What matters is that disagreement carried no force. In a functioning system, disagreement triggers deliberation. In a strained system, it triggers circumvention. The Chief of Staff's account suggests that decisions increasingly flowed around institutional filters rather than through them. When that happens, policy becomes reactive and governance becomes personal. This is where temperament intersects with structure. The description of the president as having an alcoholic personality is not a casual insult. It is a behavioral diagnosis, one defined by impulse, emotional escalation, denial of consequence, and resistance to correction. The president's acceptance of this characterization is telling, not because it is disarming, but because it normalizes instability. Leadership requires not just conviction, but self-regulation. Without it, the system must compensate, and according to this account, the system struggled to do so. We also see how loyalty becomes a substitute for competence in such environments. Advisors are not evaluated by outcomes, but by alignment. Questioning decisions becomes risky. Silence becomes safer. Over time, this reshapes institutional behavior. Warnings soften. Language becomes indirect. Responsibility diffuses. The result is not chaos, but something quieter and more dangerous: drift. This drift is reinforced by distraction. Cultural conflict over language, symbols, and identity becomes a stage on which authority performs strength, even as material conditions worsen beneath the surface. Rising costs, reduced consumer spending, and increasing unemployment are not ideological abstractions. They are measurable indicators of economic stress, yet they struggle to command sustained attention in a political environment optimized for spectacle. Symbolic victories are easier to declare than structural solutions are to deliver, and so governance becomes fragmented. One part of the system manages optics, another manages fallout, very little manages long-term stability. What this interview ultimately reveals is not just internal dysfunction, but a governing logic that prioritizes immediate affirmation over institutional health. That logic does not require bad intentions. It requires only unchecked power, and unchecked power rarely announces itself loudly. It embeds itself quietly in habits, in workarounds, in normalized exceptions. By the time it becomes visible to the public, it is already well established. It is important to be clear about what this moment represents and what it does not. This is not a referendum on one interview, one official, or even one administration. What it reveals is a pattern that has been building for years, the gradual weakening of institutional restraint in favor of personal authority. Democratic systems are not designed to rely on good intentions. They are designed to survive flawed individuals by distributing power, enforcing limits, and slowing decisions that carry serious consequences. When those safeguards erode, politics becomes less about governance and more about performance. What replaces institutions is not efficiency, but improvisation. What replaces accountability is narrative, and what replaces policy is loyalty signaling. This is how democracies do not collapse suddenly, but thin out over time. Citizens are not asked to surrender their rights. They are asked to accept exceptions, one at a time, each one justified as temporary, necessary, or harmless. Eventually, the exception becomes the rule. The danger is not that people stop believing in democracy. The danger is that democracy continues to exist in form while losing its function. When power no longer expects to be corrected internally, it must eventually be corrected externally, by courts, by markets, or by social unrest. And those corrections are always more disruptive, more expensive, and more painful. What this interview shows us is an internal system that increasingly failed to self-correct. And history is clear on this point. Systems that cannot correct themselves do not remain stable for long. They drift, they harden, and eventually they fracture. The question is not whether this moment is alarming. The question is whether we recognize it early enough to matter. Moments like this are rarely remembered for what they reveal in the moment. They are remembered for what people chose to do with that revelation. The interview itself will fade from the headlines. Another story will replace it. Another controversy will demand attention. That is how the news cycle works. What does not fade as easily are the patterns it exposes. A system where restraint is advisory rather than binding, a culture where loyalty outweighs correction, a style of governance that treats institutions as obstacles rather than safeguards. None of this requires corruption in the traditional sense. It requires only impatience with limits. Democratic systems are slow by design. They are meant to frustrate impulse, absorb conflict, and force compromise. When those qualities are treated as weaknesses, power begins to move faster than accountability can follow. And that is when risk accumulates quietly. The responsibility then does not rest solely with leaders or advisors. It rests with citizens, with institutions, and with our collective willingness to distinguish between spectacle and substance. Not every warning arrives as a crisis. Some arrive as admissions. Others arrive as moments when insiders speak more freely than they intended. The challenge is recognizing those moments for what they are. Because democracies rarely disappear overnight. They erode when attention drifts, when norms feel optional, and when accountability becomes someone else's responsibility. The question is not whether this interview was damaging or unfair. The question is whether we are willing to listen when power reveals itself quietly, casually, and without apology. Good night.